Spirit of God, we pray that you make your presence known among us, so that these ancient words become your living word, and we become your living witnesses. To that end, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of each one of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. We are reading from Matthew's Gospel. We're reading not so much about the Magi today. We will do that next week when we officially celebrate Epiphany. So you get 2 weeks of a little bit of Herod, but this week is all about King Herod. We don't like to spend much time with him. He seems like an intrusion in the Christmas story. But just like John the Baptist, John and Herod provide some reality for us in the midst of this season. So we turn our hearts and minds to Matthew's Gospel in the 2nd chapter, verses 13 through 23. Let us listen for what the Spirit may be speaking to the church. Now after the Magi had left, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt and remain there until I tell you. For Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him." Then Joseph got up, took the child and his mother by night and went to Egypt and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet, "Out of Egypt I have called my son." When Herod saw that he had been tricked by the Magi, he was infuriated, and he sent and killed all the children in and around Bethlehem who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had learned from the Magi. Then was fulfilled what was spoken through the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, wailing and loud lamentation. Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be consoled because they are no more. When Herod died, an angel of the Lord suddenly appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother and go to the land of Israel, for those who were seeking the child's life are dead." Then Joseph got up, took the child and his mother and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was the ruler of Judea in the place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. And after being warned in a dream, he went away to the district of Galilee. There he made his home in a town called Nazareth, so that what had been spoken through the prophets might be fulfilled. He will be called a Nazarene. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. There was only one. There was only one King of the Jews, and his name was Herod. It's an odd title, frankly, king of this small little land. In fact, that wasn't his initial title. He had to lobby Rome to get that title. They didn't want to give it to him. They didn't think he was really a king after all. It's a title that could only have been given by the Roman Senate. So you would imagine, because he had to work so hard just to get it, that he would go to any length to protect it. That's what those in power often do. Keeping the status quo in power is more important than principle or morals. And what we know about this historical figure of Herod is a lot. He was the sort of king that was obsessed with security and order. In fact, all public protest was outlawed, yet it happened anyway. And when it happened, he would actually plant protesters in the crowd. Special security. And their job was to make sure that the protests would become violent, so that the king would have full justification to bring down full military might. It's not new. It's been going on a long time. Herod was also not above killing off his enemies or a wife or two. Whoever stood in his way, whoever challenged his fragile ego would find themselves in real trouble or dead. He even had his own special secret police force that would follow fellow citizens to report on them. For Herod, nothing was going to stand in the way of maintaining and growing his power. The gospel, according to Herod, is about power, is about control, is about security. And he had a constant concern for his own reputation. Oddly enough, those who surrounded him, other rulers from the area, actually looked to Herod in many ways as a savior. He brought peace and security to a region known to be fractured by violence. So they choose order because, well, frankly, it was better for the economy. But despite Herod being this sort of despotic leader that I've just painted a picture of, he's not a monster. How do we know that? Well, he did a lot for the nation. It would be easy to turn Herod into a caricature, a demon that we could be nothing like, but the truth is he's a lot more familiar to us than we'd like to admit. The focus of his rule was to make Jerusalem a great power once again, even though it was a puppet state of Rome. Herod spent lavish sums on his various building projects. Generous gifts he also sent to other kingdoms to show how powerful he was. Even Rome received gifts from King Herod. What we know is his buildings were very large and ambitious projects. Some of those buildings stand to this day. Herod was even responsible for the construction on the Temple Mount. And it means he had to raise significant funds, and the poor were laid with heavy taxes. But it was also said, even in those who didn't like Herod all that much, is that he genuinely cared for the people. In fact, we have an example of this. There was a severe famine in 25 BC, and he just opened the food stores and gave it away to make sure that people wouldn't starve. However, it also might have been to avoid an uprising. Bread riots have been a historical reality, but he knew how to deal with it, and he bought their love and loyalty. He also knew how to talk out of both sides of his mouth. He converted to Judaism so that he would have the support of the Jewish community. To the pagans, he was comfortable talking as a pagan. And it all worked. He maintained order in a way that no one had for generations upon generations. And even the people we know who suffered under his rule, who suffered under his demanding taxes for building projects, were the very people who supported his kingship. And so, by all accounts, what we know is Herod is not a monster who would pull the wings off of butterflies. He was a complex figure, a human being. Understanding, he understood well the reality of power politics and was a populist hero. The thing is, if Herod was a monster, it'd be easy to preach that sermon, don't be like that guy. But when we live in a time where children are killed in a distance by drones or locked in cages, were taken from their parents and lost, we need to recognize that Herod isn't a monster, that in some ways he's like us, and that we might be more like those we politically dislike than we care to think. That Herod, at the end of the day, resides in all of us, given the circumstances and power. How might we act? It's easy to dismiss the bad guys. Our films do it, to make things simple, good, and bad, weak or strong. That's not how human beings work. That's how cartoon characters act. And Herod was not a cartoon character. So when we read this story about the death of the babies in Bethlehem. We need to know that it's not some fanciful reality, but it is a reality that we know even in our own time. And it would have been keeping with his character. And he probably wouldn't have lost a moment's sleep. When the Magi come looking for a new king of the Jews, Herod and all of Jerusalem were terrified. All of Jerusalem were terrified, because if there's a new king, then the order that they had gotten used to, even if they didn't like it, was coming to an end. Herod was terrified because he wanted to maintain power. And if a new king arose, that means he had to be killed. And the people, because of the instability, they would have been worried. So this is why he secretly calls the Magi to do his bidding and to find the child. But Herod's plans go wrong because God has other plans, even if Herod will know nothing of it. Now, we know that some historians and some folks in the church doubt that the slaughter in Bethlehem ever happened. After all, there's no historical record of it. However, what we do know is that if it did happen, that number would have been about less than 20 children who were male under the age of 2 in that tiny town. So imagine for a moment sacrificing just 20 kids on the altar of security. And then imagine for a moment no one decides to document it. Could you imagine that actually happening? Seems pretty plausible to me. Sure, there wasn't a record, but I'm more inclined to believe the voices of those who've been marginalized. But here's the thing. Herod didn't wield the sword. He didn't go. Nor did he know where the baby was born. It took other people. For Herod to slaughter those 20 children to protect his order, it took other people just doing their jobs. It took other people just doing their jobs for innocent people to die. And that is the way it has always been. Hitler didn't drive the trains and round up Jewish people. The citizens did, in God's name. King Leopold of Belgium, you have to look that up if you don't know the story, didn't create a genocide in the Congo by himself. He barely ever traveled there. Here's the thing. The leaders who inspire fear and hate are seldom the ones doing the dirty work. Many of you know that I lived for a year in Northern Ireland, and there was a Presbyterian minister by the name of Ian Paisley, God rest his soul, who would preach on Sunday nights the evils of Catholicism and how they were damned to hell. And then when people would kill in his name, he would say, I didn't tell him to do it. Charles Manson never killed anybody. Things to think about, because language matters. And here I've brought down your Christmas celebration, the joy of the season that we try to reach. But here's the thing. We cannot talk about the joy of the season without talking about the reality of the whole story and the reality of our whole lives. We don't live in the land of endless joy. We live in the land of despair and death and compromise and leaders who are fools. And we have to figure out how to live faithfully. And the stories of our faith tell us just how others have done it. As we celebrate the birth of Jesus, we come face to face with the horrific reality and the death of the boys of Bethlehem. While Jesus lives, these other families have lost their children. Which leaves the question for us, what are we to do when others are sacrificed on this altar? What are we to do in the face of politicians more interested in protecting their reputation than the justice of God? What are we to do as those who've been called to care for the poor, the widow, and orphan, when our leaders ignore their plight and call them weak. The passage gives us some clue, but not much. And the way we get there is by asking, what did Joseph do? How did the Magi act? Which I'll say more about them next week. But what they do is they listen to dreams. They pay attention to outside the official manuscripts of the day. We might say they might ignore the tweet storms and look for the stars instead. So is that what we need to be doing? I wouldn't say it's a bad idea. To listen for the places outside the official transcripts. Working to be more attuned to the way in which God may be at work around us is really our calling. And the even greater message is to live in hope. When kings and power brokers rage, God can work through them, certainly. More often than not, God has worked around them, or even despite them. And they will never know anything about it. But we cannot allow ourselves to be driven to any sort of despair in the face of foolishness. Our calling is to be the ones who listen and the ones who hope. And to recognize that hope can change things. And think about our own lives. Where in our own lives do we have the power to be beacons of hope and agents of change? Whenever we can, wherever we are. And we must always do it with great love. The gospel of Jesus Christ is not the gospel of expediency. It is not the gospel of status quo. It is not the gospel of manipulation or control. It is the gospel of love. No matter what the Herods in every age do, the good news is they do not have the last word. The word lives on and has power beyond them, and our calling is to follow to the best of our ability, always living in touch.